There are streets in the world that never make it onto postcards, broken pavements, graffiti-marked walls, and the kind of silence that only a lonely child truly knows. Manchester had one of those streets, and on it lived a boy named Jimmy Grimble. Every evening, when the world wasn't watching, Jimmy would take his football and disappear into the rhythm of his own feet. Trick after trick, spin after spin, he was poetry in motion, but only when no one could see. Because the moment eyes landed on him, something inside Jimmy shut down like a light switched off. He carried his talent like a secret he was too afraid to tell. At home, life wasn't much warmer. His mother Donna meant well, but she had her own battles. Then came Johnny, her new boyfriend, sliding into their world with a crooked smile and nervous energy. He tried to connect with Jimmy through football, that universal language of men and boys. But during a clumsy moment over the ball, Johnny knocked Jimmy to the ground. And just like that, whatever thin thread of trust had been forming snapped clean in two. Donna asked Jimmy to give Johnny a chance. Jimmy said nothing. His silence said everything. School was its own kind of war zone. Greenock High was not a place for the quiet or the gentle, and Jimmy was both. Two shadows followed him through those corridors, Psycho and Gordon, a pair of bullies who seemed to exist purely to make others miserable. The day Jimmy noticed a girl named Sarah, it felt for one bright second like the world had offered him something beautiful. She had a spark in her eyes that made the gray school hallways feel almost alive. But before a single word could pass between them, Gordon and his crew descended like a storm, ripping that moment away and leaving Jimmy cornered in an alley, humiliated, his bag ruined, his dignity scraped raw. And the cruelest part? His football coach, Eric Weir, watched from a window above and turned away without blinking. Something stubborn lives inside people who have been knocked down too many times. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly refuses to quit. That same afternoon, Jimmy spotted a notice on the school wall: football tryouts for the Greenock team. His heart responded before his brain could talk him out of it. He showed up to the field, boots worn, nerves wired tight, hoping this might finally be his door. But the universe wasn't done testing him. Gordon and Psycho were already there, already laughing, already owning the space. And somewhere in the school office, Gordon's father Ken was making a deal with the principal, money for the school in exchange for putting his son in the spotlight. Football had been reduced to a business transaction, and nobody at that tryout knew it yet. Training began, and Gordon played like someone performing rather than competing, every touch a performance for invisible cameras. Then, he kicked the ball directly into Jimmy's face. Not an accident. A message. Coach Eric had seen enough. He threw Gordon off the field in front of everyone, a rare act of defiance. But by the next morning, the principal had reversed it all. Money talks, and in Greenock High, it screamed. Gordon was back on the team. Eric stood there, jaw tight, swallowing something that tasted like defeat. He announced their first match would be against Wreckingham School, said it flatly, like a man reading from someone else's script. That evening, walking home through streets turning orange in the dying light, Jimmy passed a cemetery and saw Sarah sitting alone among the gravestones, looking entirely unbothered by the world. She glanced at him with something soft in her eyes, something that said she understood being on the outside of things. And Jimmy, overwhelmed by everything he felt in that moment, did what he always did. He ran. Later, when he went to collect his mother from work and found she had to stay late, he walked home alone, carrying all that weight in silence. That's when Gordon and Psycho found him again, chasing him through narrow streets until a strange old woman seemed to materialize out of the shadows themselves, pulling Jimmy into the basement of a crumbling building and slamming the world out behind her. Her name was Alice, and she had the kind of face that had lived 1,000 stories. She told Jimmy she had watched him play from a distance, and that she believed in him with a certainty that left no room for argument. Then she pressed into his hands a pair of old, weathered football boots. She looked him straight in the eye and said the boots were magic, that they would transform him, unlock something extraordinary that the world had been waiting to see. Jimmy thanked her politely, walked 2 blocks, and dropped them in a garbage can. He didn't believe in magic. He barely believed in himself. The next morning rewrote something in Jimmy. He stepped outside to find Sarah surrounded by 3 girls mocking her, calling her names, circling her like she was prey. But Sarah stood still in the middle of it all, eyes calm, jaw set. She told them she wasn't what they called her. She was a boxer. Then she proved it with one clean punch that sent the ringleader stumbling. Jimmy watched with wide eyes, feeling something ignite in his chest. He was falling for her fast, and she had no idea. Rushing to make the team's first match, Gordon's gang ambushed him again, grabbing his boots and hurling them into a passing garbage truck. And it was in that desperate, stumbling run back to Alice's garbage can that Jimmy's hands closed around those old boots again, as if they had been waiting for him all along. The first match at Rockingham Stadium was less football and more organized violence. The pitch was mud and mayhem, tackles that were really assaults, a referee who had clearly been briefed beforehand, and opponents who played like they had never heard of rules. Jimmy sat on the bench watching the chaos unfold, a substitute in a match that seemed designed to bury them. Then Gordon took a heavy hit and went down, and Eric's eyes moved to Jimmy. He was called onto that muddy battlefield with everything against him. A striker bore down on goal, fumbled the ball for a single heartbeat, and Jimmy struck it. The ball flew clean and true from a distance nobody expected, curling into the net while the goalkeeper stared at his phone. For a stunned, perfect moment, the world held its breath. Then his teammates crashed into him, arms wide, voices loud, and Jimmy Grimble, quiet, invisible Jimmy, felt for the first time in his life like he truly existed. He ran straight to Alice afterward, breathless with gratitude. She smiled that patient smile and corrected the story gently. There was no magic. The boots had belonged to a man named Robbie Brewer, once connected to Manchester City. That was all. No enchantment, just leather and history. Jimmy turned it over in his mind all the way home, arriving to find a new complication. Johnny had moved in permanently. The house felt smaller instantly. But life pushed forward regardless, and the next morning brought an unexpected gift. Sarah walking up to him at school, telling him she had heard about the match. She didn't care about football, she said, but courage? Courage she respected. She invited him into her world, and Jimmy followed her to a cemetery where she showed him a grave that mattered to her. Then she noticed the boots in his bag, and something clicked behind her eyes when he mentioned the name Robbie Brewer. She had heard it before. Somewhere. She led him to another grave, different man, same name. The mystery deepened, and Jimmy felt the pull of a truth just out of reach. The search led him to the Manchester City Stadium, but it was Johnny, bribed with $50 by Donna, who took him there. While Jimmy stood outside dreaming of answers, Johnny slipped into a nearby bar and walked straight into trouble. 2 men emptied his pockets and sent him out with a warning. No money meant no tickets, and Jimmy went home with nothing but a quiet, burning determination to come back. He told Sarah everything the next day. She offered to come with him, and he said yes before she had finished the sentence. At the stadium, a janitor sent them to a house across the street with a knowing look. Jimmy knocked on the door. It swung open, and there stood Eric, his school coach, in an entirely different light. The truth spilled out slowly. Eric had once been a striker for Manchester City. In his very first match, he had been the team's top scorer. But something had broken inside him over the years, and the man who had once lit up stadiums was now running drills at Greenock High without fire or hope. Jimmy looked at him and said, simply, that the team needed him. Not a plea. A fact. And something behind Eric's eyes shifted. The second match against Northmoor began with Ken hijacking the team talk, reducing an entire tactical plan to 3 words, pass to Gordon. The team fractured immediately, playing like strangers, conceding in the first half with the mechanical efficiency of a machine breaking down. Then, in the stands, a man named Pete Drake noticed Jimmy's boots. He recognized them. He recognized Eric. He stood up and told everyone within earshot that this quiet, defeated coach had once been Manchester City's greatest scorer. The locker room fell silent. Players who had rolled their eyes at Eric's instructions were suddenly looking at him differently, something they hadn't given him before: respect. The second half was a different match entirely. The team listened. Jimmy received the ball and shot without hesitation goal. Then he dribbled through defenders like they were standing still, found himself one-on-one with the goalkeeper, and made no mistake. The final whistle blew on a victory that felt less like a scoreline and more like a resurrection. Match by match, Jimmy grew into someone new. The shyness didn't vanish so much as transform. It became quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't shout but never wavers. Greenock won. And won again. And again. Gordon drifted to the edges of the story, while Jimmy moved to its center. Then one night after training, Eric's car gave up on a dark road and left the whole team stranded. A delivery truck slowed and stopped, and the driver leaning out the window was Harry. He saw Jimmy and smiled like a man who had been hoping for exactly this. He drove them home, collected Donna from work along the way, an act of simple kindness that arrived like a complication. Johnny was waiting at the door. He saw Donna with Harry, and the mask slipped completely. Harry tried to explain. Johnny told him to leave. The house felt like a held breath, and Jimmy lay awake that night with something unsettled behind his ribs. When the semi-final came, Jimmy was extraordinary. A long-range strike, a perfectly timed header. Greenock won, and the final, played at the Manchester City Stadium itself, became the only thing anyone could talk about. Jimmy went to find Alice and share the news, carrying the joy of it like an offering. In return, she gave him something heavier, her story. She had loved a man named Robbie once, she said. They had separated because she kept a secret, that Robbie had an eye condition that was slowly worsening. She hadn't told him because she feared the truth would end his football. She believed a gentle lie could sometimes be kinder than a hard truth. Jimmy didn't agree, but he looked at this woman, weathered, homeless, brilliant, and invited her to come watch him play in the final. She accepted with tears she pretended weren't there. The days before the final moved like a held breath slowly being released. Jimmy said goodbye to his mother and walked toward training, stopping when he found Sarah. He asked if she would come to the match. She said maybe, and the way she said it meant yes. He walked on, turning the corner toward Alice's building, and stopped dead. A crane stood outside. Workers moved with cold, professional efficiency. He ran inside shouting, knowing before he reached her what he would find. Alice lay on the ground, still, the cold night having taken her while the world slept. The woman who had believed in him before he believed in himself was gone. Jimmy sat beside her for a moment that lasted forever, then walked out carrying a grief too large and too quiet for anyone else to see. The final began with the stadium full and the sky enormous overhead. But behind the scenes, the ugliness hadn't finished. Ken told the principal the money he had promised would only come if Greenock won, and only if Gordon was the star. The principal, drowning in pressure, went to Eric and asked him to bench Jimmy. Eric refused. So the principal was marched to the locker room and made to say it himself, directly to the team. He barely got the words out before the players rose as one. Even Psycho, who had once made Jimmy's life miserable, stood up and said the same thing everyone was saying. If Jimmy doesn't play, we don't play. The principal left the room a smaller man. But Gordon had one last act of sabotage left in him. He found Jimmy's boots and threw them into the river. When Jimmy discovered they were gone, something inside him went cold. Without those boots, he told himself, he was nothing. The first half confirmed his fear. Jimmy was a ghost of himself, misreading passes, losing the ball, moving like someone pretending to be a footballer. The other team scored twice, and Eric watched with the expression of a man watching something precious slip through his fingers. When the whistle blew for halftime, everyone else walked to the dressing room. Jimmy stayed on the pitch alone. Then Eric came. And Harry came. And between them, they told him the truth. Eric confessed the real reason he had left professional football: a moment of weakness, a drink too many, a tackle that had ended another man's career forever. He had carried that guilt like a stone tied around his neck for years. He told Jimmy he didn't want to watch him repeat the same mistake of surrendering to fear. Then Harry added the thread that unraveled everything. He said he knew who Robbie Brewer was. He took Jimmy to a stadium worker named Bob. And Bob told him the whole truth. Robbie Brewer was never a Manchester City player. He was the team's mascot. He was Alice's son. The boots were ordinary leather. The magic had always been fiction, invented by a lonely old woman who wanted to give a lonely boy something to stand on. For one terrible second, the ground disappeared from under Jimmy. Then, slowly, it came back, more solid than before. Because he understood now, every goal he had scored, every defender he had left behind, every moment of grace on that pitch, that had been him. Only him. Always him. The second half was a different story written by a different Jimmy. He moved with the kind of certainty that cannot be faked or learned. It can only be found. He drove a shot into the net and the scoreboard blinked. 2-1. The crowd woke up. He won the ball again, looked up and saw Gordon on the far side making himself available. Jimmy passed to him, a clean, generous pass, and Gordon scored. 2-2. The match was alive again with 60 seconds on the clock. The opposition pushed forward desperately. Casper threw himself at the ball and turned it wide with both hands. The clearance fell to Jimmy, who was already running. One last chance. One last moment. And there was Gordon again, calling for it arms wide. Jimmy remembered everything. The humiliation in the corridor, the boot in his face, the boots thrown into the river. He remembered Alice. He remembered the cold building and the crane outside it. He chose to pass. Then, at the very last fraction of a second, he changed his mind about how, and struck it hard and flat at Gordon's face, exactly as Gordon had once done to him. The ball cannonied off Gordon's head and buried itself in the net. 3-2. The roar that followed was not just celebration. It was release. Years of it. After the final whistle, a football agent made his way through the crowd. Ken lunged forward with Gordon in tow, but Gordon stopped him. Quietly, with a steadiness that surprised everyone including himself, Gordon said his dream was Manchester City, and he wanted to earn it the right way, under a coach he now respected. The boy who had been the story's villain had quietly rewritten his ending. And Jimmy, finally, gloriously himself, found Sarah in the crowd. He walked toward her without hesitation, without the old trembling in his hands, and kissed her in front of everyone. She kissed him back and smiled against his lips. Later, as the stadium began to empty and the evening settled in, Jimmy asked Eric to take one last penalty. Eric stepped up to the spot, looked at the goal like it was an old friend, and struck the ball clean and true. It flew into the net, and Casper didn't stand a chance. For a long moment, the two of them just looked at each other in the quiet of that enormous stadium. No words were needed. Some things, the love of a game, the weight of a boot on a ball, the feeling of being exactly where you're meant to be, those things don't need explaining. They just are. And now, finally, so was Jimmy.